Aisino taski Lana Whiskeyjack nitsigason onexkapo nitsikotsinia. Agua, I'm a human. Firstly, I'm a human of this earth. My name is Lana Whiskeyjack, and I'm from Sadly Cree Nation. I'm a multidisciplinary artist. I was trained in ceramic sculpting, but I also self-taught painter and also do digital storytelling. So I call myself a multidisciplinary visual storyteller and work in multiple mediums. The work I feel I do is definitely Indigenous surrealism to realism to a futuristic genres in between all of those.
My name is Erik Lee, currently residing in Maskwacis. And my mother was from the Maskwacis Plains Cree on the Ermineskin tribe. And my father came from Denmark when he was a boy. I create primarily sterling silver jewelry. I cut stones and fabricate silver from scratch. I like to incorporate a lot of Plains Cree designs and motifs. I tan hides and I do other carving and all those kind of things, but primarily silversmithing is my thing right now. Indigenous people love jewelry, and we always have, right? Whether it's elk teeth or quills or beads or, you know, carved bone and stone and all these things. Like our everyday outfits were an outward expression of our individuality as well as our connection to our family and our tribe. And so using those motifs to express, hey, well, for me, right, I'm a Nehiyaw and I wear this.
I definitely was able to hold a pen or a crayon and draw before I can even write. My mother was always encouraging, so I've always sketched. I played with clay in our cellar. Back in the day when we had no toys, we would make toys out of everything. And of course, our playground was like 5 kilometers, you know, a radius. So it'd be like the land is so important to my imagination. Being alone on a land as a kid or with other children, like how, I mean, films and stories and books influenced our imagination of being on the land. But stories from our uncles, like the scary stories, the teaching stories, all of those different stories that we heard around a campfire, around the kitchen table, were really important in developing my imagination. Especially around fear, it was something that, because I came from such a strong matriarch, to me, who is fearless, it was like when my imagination would, you know, animate those stories, especially when I'm on the land, and then I confronted those fears. Building confidence and courage was really important part of my creative process of always like pushing myself to go deeper, pushing myself to explore more. I lived in many different homes and lands, environments. I mean, the most impactful, I was living with my grandmother. During the summers, we would live in a little cook'em's tent or trapper's tent and go medicine picking. She was a powerful woman who really connected to the land as well as the people who lived on the land, including like a lot of the Ukrainians who lived around the reserve, and helping them out and sharing knowledge, but traveling far and wide to help other people. So I think as, now as a professor in the university, like growing up, my grandmother told me, go to school, travel the world, like basically, carry on the work is by experience as much as we can, but never, ever forget where you come from. Don't forget who you are. You're Nahio as well.
Growing up and being taught by my parents how to exist and how to interact with people and the universe, and to try and be a kind and considerate and compassionate human being, that has influenced me in a way that guides my work. I grew up around watching powwow and seeing the outfits and just, really, I think just taking that in as a kid was sort of an informal study in that. And then I think there's also, a certain bit of genetic memory, something that's in your DNA that you kind of can't explain. I think a lot of our Indigenous art forms as well are tied to the land, right? And I've started out working with stone and bone and antler and wood. So you're really connected, you have weaving traditions and, like I mentioned, quill work. And those things are all very tied to being a part of a universe, being a part of that. In Cree, it's called Wakotowin. I moved out to Vancouver Island about 10 or 12 years ago. I met some really cool West Coast carvers, and I was carving wood with them, Alfred Robertson and Jackson Robertson. And one day, Jackson was engraving copper and silver in the shop, and I asked him if he could teach me, and he said, well, I can't really teach you, but sit down here, watch me, and then you take a shot at it. And that's kind of how it started. Since then, I've been influenced and mentored by a number of different artists. Amanda Hadatsa, silversmith, who's now passed on, his name was Winston Mason Sr. He taught me a bunch of stuff. I learned some stuff from Randy Cook, who's out on the West Coast. I learned from Tim Herrera, who's in the Pueblos in New Mexico. And I also learned from Ray Scott, who's Navajo, very well-known Navajo jeweler. I would find a mentor, somebody that I looked up to or appreciated their work, and just approach them and ask them. And most times they were very free with giving me advice and helping me along the way. Western institutions and art institutions, universities and stuff like that, are very different from the way Indigenous artistic traditions are passed on. A lot of the time, the art institutions are viewing your work through their lens, whereas I think with an Indigenous artist and Indigenous art traditions, there's a little bit more freedom for you to express your worldview and your lens.
Even though English is the language I speak, my grandmother has reminded me, I think in Cree. And so it's really important for people who don't know, who grew up on the land, that connection to land with their, Cree-speaking family, that just being around in that language and on the land, in those stories, actually still gave us that Cree worldview, even though we're limited by our English. So this is where visual technique and skills were developed, was pushing myself to try different ways of translating English into my Cree worldview and making sense of the world. There's a lot of traditional kind of teachings in my paintings. With the 13 moons, you see some of the tools that we've had gayas a long time ago. There's medicines, plant medicines in those paintings, but they're also, again, reflecting not only my generation, but for future generation through the clothing, through the expression. Another example is a long time ago, we were so inclusive of gender and sexual diversity. In fact, it was part of our Wakotwin. We never even questioned or interfered in someone's autonomy of how they express themselves through their gender and sexuality. I see our younger generation who are really embracing that gender fluidity, which to me is going back to our traditions, right? So there's an example of how those teachings are actually coming back full circle, and how we are teaching about that is through our arts. This is how we're bringing back those really, our Wakotwin laws, our natural laws of kindness and truth and sharing and courage through our art expressions, through film, through music, through visual, through dance, through theater, all of that, of being able to bring our ancestral knowledge into a contemporary language, for a visual language for all of us to learn from. Our old stories have to make sense to our current generation, and we need to keep connected to those stories, but we also have to keep room in our lodges to adapt how we connect to those stories or songs or ceremonies, because our brains have changed on that biophysical level. And so how do we adapt, our traditional knowledge or our ancestral knowledge to our contemporary experiences? We have technology. We're in this fourth industrial revolution. How do we adapt those stories and be able to translate those stories, but still keep connected to those storytelling protocols? How do we honor them?
Any young people, or older people for that matter, that have an interest in art, follow it, because when you don't listen to your desire or your dream to do that, then you're ignoring your core self. That's the first thing. Second thing is, if you come from a specific tribe or region, research that. Ask your family. If you don't have connection to your family, there are people in your community that know about these things, right? About the art. study as much as you can about the artistic traditions of your specific nation. Try to get good at that stuff. I think those are the jumping off points. Once you know, and once you've studied the artistic traditions of your nation, then you're better equipped to take it in a new direction.
When it comes to young people returning back to the culture, yes, go to those elders, offer protocols, offer those gifts. Give your time and energy to learn and commit to being a good relative through those carrying those stories. Ask to carry them and how to carry them. When I'm sharing some of those stories, like for a lot of people, they wouldn't understand those stories through my paintings because it's the paintings, the visual story actually protects it in some ways. You would need to know what you're looking at for in order to understand what that bird means, what that plant means, what does carrying that knife mean, right? That mogaman. There are many stories within that you would need to know. And it's activated through those protocols. So I'm able to translate a lot of those stories in my own way that not only protects that knowledge, but also that that still shares just a little glimpse to spark curiosity for someone to go learn more. Now's the time where these stories need to be the medicine that help our next generation. We're getting further and further disconnected from the land, and it's those kind of stories that are going to help reconnect to the land. I am so grateful to the elders who are like, okay, these teachings aren't something you're supposed to earn. These are the teachings that you're supposed to grow up with. We want to share it with you. We want you to learn about carrying this story so you can teach it. And I'm seeing young people now, young artists who are sharing those stories in such a beautiful, kind, loving way. They're learning the language, they're learning. And then there's, of course, those who exploit, which is against our protocols. You don't exploit, you don't appropriate. You know, you have to keep those good relations.
I think it might be hard for people outside of cultural traditions to grasp the concept of cultural property. So, for example, you'd have like West Coast style, and if I'm Cree, you know, you kind of don't want to go there, right? And why would you want to? Because we have so much beautiful artistic tradition in our own area and in our own tribe. I really try to continually build my skill set and my toolbox. I don't think there's ever a point where you're done, right? I don't think there's ever a point where there's no more room for learning and evolution. I think as an artist, you really need to push yourself and to try and continually improve and continually push the boundaries as well of what is possible with Indigenous art, right? Because there are so many new avenues that are still unexplored that is just waiting for someone to step in and take that up. For me to create jewelry for people that it helps them express who they are, whether they're Indigenous or not, because my jewelry is not only for Indigenous people, it's for people. I encourage people to, if you like it, wear it. People talk about cultural appropriation, but that only happens when you don't know where it's coming from, you don't know the artist, and you don't know the tradition that they're giving you, right, in that piece of art.
When you are wearing your beaded jewelry or ribbon skirt or, you know, hats, beaded hats, like when you're wearing that in public and making a presence, for those younger folks, you are making statement that I am still here. I am still connected to this land. It's about land back. It's about, prevention of being a statistic, but it's also about promotion of how this world needs Indigenous knowledge. This Indigenous knowledge, and this is part of our prophecies, is the medicine we need to rebalance the chaos that's happening in the land, in our social behaviors and worldviews and leadership and governance. Go back to those grandmother teachings.
I use many different tools and toolkits to get where my vision is pointing me, right? And there's artists out there that are using all this digital technology as well. And so I would encourage people to explore that, because Indigenous art is not just, carving stone or painting on hides, right? It's anything we want it to be. So use all that digital technology because, we have access to it, and it can take your art form to just a next level, right? If that's what you want to do. It's also important if you want to learn like the hundreds or thousands of year old art form of quill work, and you want to do it exactly or as close as you can to the oldest historical examples that we have, do that too, right? Because those can both exist together, and there's so much room for all types of Indigenous artwork. And our people and our young people have such an original and exciting points of view that they need to be expressed, and there's all these avenues for you to do it, so do it. In a way, it is a spiritual practice for me, because I'm connecting with myself as an artist. I'm connecting with the materials and just having a lifestyle that I think is in balance, or hopefully in balance, and being able to create, right? I think the act of creation in itself is a super sacred thing, right? And so I'm very blessed and thankful to be able to be involved in that.
I've always done art. It's my first language. I always thought it was something that, when I see the canon of artists, I always imagine being part of that. But when I was learning about art history, it was all old white guys and very little women. I think we're in the time where we're waking people's spirits up. And that I hope Indigenous artists, creators will tap into their essence of being a human being and continue to pushing the limits of sharing their stories in a good, kind, loving, respectful way, because it's needed. It is so needed. We need more artists, especially in technology, to help animate these stories and their urgency for change, to impact the minds and hearts of others, to, again, help us collectively to restore balance in this world.